In the dark underworld of Seoul, power is usually measured in decibels: the roar of a gunshot, the scream of a victim, the barking of orders. But for Dae-hyun, the undisputed king of the Gwangju Syndicate, power was absolute, terrifying silence. He sat in the back of the armored sedan, watching the neon city bleed past the rain-streaked glass like watercolor paint on a dark canvas. He was a man composed of sharp angles and bespoke tailoring, a figure carved from marble and resentment. To the outside world, he was the Silent Dragon, a moniker that carried both reverence and mockery. Born into a world without sound, he had mastered the art of reading the microscopic twitches of human facial muscles, the frantic pulse in a liar's jugular, and the rhythmic vibration of fear that hummed through floorboards. He did not need to hear a man beg to know he was desperate. He did not need to hear a betrayal to feel the shift in the air pressure of a room. His disability was his fortress. Or so he told himself. The paradox of his existence was suffocating. He controlled a chaotic empire of noise, nightclubs, shipping lanes, underground gambling dens, yet he lived in a pristine, vacuum-sealed bubble. Tonight, that bubble felt heavier than usual. He rubbed his temples, where a dull, throbbing pressure had been building for weeks, a ghost in the machine of his skull. His lieutenant, a man named Choi, sat in the front seat, his mouth moving in the rear-view mirror. Dae-hyun watched the lips. "We have the shipment. The Russians are satisfied." Dae-hyun merely nodded, his gaze returning to the window. He was feared. He was obeyed. He was unstoppable. But as the car idled at a red light, he saw a street musician playing a saxophone on the corner. The man's cheeks puffed out, his body swaying with an invisible rhythm, eyes closed in ecstasy. Dae-hyun felt a sudden, violent spike of envy that nearly made him shatter the glass. He possessed billions in assets, yet he could not purchase the one thing the beggar on the corner gave away for free. The car accelerated, the vibration of the engine humming against his spine, a poor substitute for the music he had never known. The penthouse was a monument to brutalist architecture and isolation, a sprawling expanse of concrete, steel, and floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Han River. It was designed to maximize visual command. There were no hidden corners here, nowhere for an assassin to lurk. Dae-hyun entered, tossing his damp overcoat onto a leather recliner, the vibration of his own footsteps registering as familiar thuds in his heels. The lights were dimmed, casting long, melancholic shadows across the polished slate floors. It was here, in this fortress of solitude, that the sensory deprivation became a tangible weight. He poured a glass of amber whiskey, the crystal decanter catching the ambient city light, and watched the liquid swirl. He could feel the liquid hit the glass, a subtle tremor in his hand, but the clink was absent. It was a silent movie of a life, played on an infinite loop. Then, movement caught his peripheral vision. A silhouette moved near the library shelves, fluid and distinct from the jagged, nervous movements of his guards. It was the new maid, Imani. She had been with the household for 3 weeks, a quiet presence that Dae-hyun had initially categorized as background scenery, irrelevant to the violent calculus of his daily life. But she was difficult to ignore. She was 28, with skin the color of deep obsidian and eyes that held a startling, intelligent depth. She moved with a dancer's grace, a deliberate economy of motion that didn't vibrate the floorboards like the heavy-footed thugs he employed. She was dusting the upper shelves, stretching, her form illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the rain. Dae-hyun paused, the whiskey glass halfway to his lips. In his world of hypervigilance, everyone was a threat until proven otherwise, yet Imani registered as something else. A disruption. A variable he hadn't solved. He found himself studying her, not as a boss evaluates a subordinate, but as a man starved of beauty evaluates a work of art. She turned, sensing his gaze, the sixth sense that people develop when a predator enters the room, and bowed deeply. He saw her lips move. "Good evening, sir." The politeness was standard, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a calm, observant curiosity. It unsettled him. It intrigued him. The headache returned with a vengeance, no longer a dull throb but a piercing lance of white-hot agony drilling behind his right ear. It was a specific, localized pain, right where the external component of his high-end cochlear implant sat, a device that Dr. Kong, his personal physician for 20 years, had insisted he wear despite its failure to ever produce sound. To stimulate the dormant nerve, Kong had said, to prevent atrophy, Dae-hyun grimaced, dropping the whiskey glass. It shattered on the floor. He didn't hear the crash, but he felt the vibration of the impact travel up his legs. He stumbled, gripping the edge of the granite island, his knuckles turning white. The room began to spin, the visual input of the city lights smearing into nauseating streaks of neon. This was not a migraine. This was a malfunction. He gasped for air, his vision tunneling. He tried to signal for his guards, but his hands were shaking too violently to sign. Through the haze of pain, he saw Imani rush forward. She didn't scream or panic. Her face was a mask of focused determination. She bypassed the broken glass, her movements swift and silent, appearing at his side like a phantom. She reached out, her hands warm and firm against his biceps, steadying him. He looked into her eyes, seeing his own reflection distorted by pain. He tried to push her away. Weakness was death in his world, and he could not be seen like this. But he lacked the strength. The agony was radiating from the device behind his ear, sending electric shocks down his neck. Imani seemed to realize the source immediately. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the device. Her eyes narrowed, not with confusion, but with recognition. A flash of anger crossed her features, a strange emotion for a maid witnessing a medical emergency. She guided him to a chair, forcing him down. Her lips moved, urgent and precise. Hold still. The command was so authoritative that Dae-hyun, a man who commanded armies, froze. What happened next defied every rule of his existence. Imani didn't call for help. She didn't run for the intercom. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, specialized multi-tool, something a maid would never carry, something that looked more suited to a watchmaker or a bomb technician. She stepped in close, her body pressing against his shoulder, her scent of jasmine and rain overwhelming his senses. He felt the cold metal of the tool against the skin behind his ear. Panic flared in his chest. Was she an assassin? Was this the end? But the pain was so blinding he couldn't fight back. With surgical precision, she manipulated the casing of his external processor. He felt a click, a vibration that rattled his skull, and then she pulled something out. It wasn't a battery. It wasn't a wire. She held it up to the light, her expression grim. It was a small, translucent chip, no larger than a fingernail, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic red light. It was a dampener, a signal jammer, a parasitic piece of technology designed not to aid hearing, but to suppress it. Dae-hyun stared at the object, his mind reeling, trying to comprehend the geometry of the betrayal. He had been told his nerves were dead. He had been told there was no hope. But as Imani tossed the chip onto the table, she reached back to his ear and adjusted a frequency dial on the processor that had been locked for decades. She looked at him, her eyes fierce, and whispered something. But he didn't read her lips. He didn't have to. The sensation hit him like a physical blow, a tidal wave of pressure that nearly knocked him out of the chair. It wasn't sound, not at first. It was violence. It was a raw, scraping, chaotic intrusion into his sanctuary of silence. The air itself seemed to scream. A low, thunderous roar filled his head, the sound of his own blood rushing through his veins. The hum of the refrigerator in the far corner sounded like a jet engine taking off. The rain against the window, previously a poetic visual, was now a barrage of machine gun fire. Tuck, 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 tuck. He clamped his hands over his ears, curling inward, a guttural cry ripping from his throat. He heard that too, a ragged, animalistic sound that terrified him because he had never heard his own voice before. It was deep, rasping, and uncontrolled. Sensory amplification was an understatement. This was sensory assault. The world was too loud, too sharp, too present. Every dust mote seemed to have a frequency. The fabric of his shirt rustling against his skin sounded like sandpaper on concrete. He was drowning in a sea of noise, his brain scrambling to interpret signals it hadn't processed since birth. He was gasping, hyperventilating, the shock threatening to send him into cardiac arrest. He was a god brought down to earth, stripped of his armor, flayed alive by the atmosphere. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the visual input to focus on the auditory agony, but the synesthesia was overwhelming. The sounds had colors, jagged flashes of red and violent purple bursting behind his eyelids. Through the chaos, a single sound began to cut through the static. It was soft, rhythmic, and melodic. A lifeline thrown into a hurricane. It was a voice. Not the distorted, muffled vibrations he had imagined, but a clear, resonant tone that seemed to wrap around his frayed nerves like warm silk. "Look at me," the voice said. "Focus on me." He opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face, tears of pain, of shock, of a lifetime of silence breaking. Imani was kneeling before him, her hands cupping his face, her thumbs stroking his cheekbones. Her mouth was moving, and for the first time, the movement matched the sound. "Breathe, Daehyun. Just breathe." The sound of his name, spoken by another human being, was the most profound thing he had ever experienced. It was intimate, terrifyingly real. He stared at her, seeing her not just as a maid, but as the architect of his rebirth. The realization hit him with the force of a bullet. He could hear. He had always been able to hear. The dampeners she had removed. It meant his disability was a lie. A manufactured cage. His doctor, his lieutenant, the people he trusted, they had done this. They had kept him deaf to control him, to keep him isolated, to make him the perfect, predictable weapon. The shock began to transmute into a cold, lethal fury, but Imani held his gaze, anchoring him in the present. "Do not let the noise win," she whispered, her voice a soothing contrast to the mechanical shrieks of the apartment. "Listen to my voice." Only my voice, in that moment, amidst the cacophony of a new world, a dark, dangerous romance was born, not of flowers and dates, but of shared secrets and the shattering of chains. He leaned into her touch, the first sound he truly understood being the beat of her heart as she pulled him into an embrace, shielding him from the noise of the world he was about to burn down. For the first hour, Daehyun remained in the chair, his body trembling with the aftershocks of sensory integration. Every input was a physical assault. The distant wail of a siren 3 miles away felt like a needle being dragged across the surface of his brain. The hum of the penthouse's climate control system was a low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate in his molars. Imani did not leave his side. She became the filter, the buffer between his raw, exposed nerves and the chaotic frequency of existence. She moved around the room, dampening the environment, closing heavy velvet drapes to muffle the street noise, placing thick rugs over the echoing slate, turning off the buzzing halogen lights until only the soft, silent glow of a singular lamp remained. She returned to him, her movements now accompanied by the soft swish-swish of fabric, a sound he found inexplicably erotic and grounding. She adjusted the dial on the processor again, dialing the sensitivity down, fine-tuning the chaos into something manageable. "Focus on the small sounds," she instructed, her voice a low contralto that resonated in his chest. "Don't try to hear the city. Hear the room. Hear the clock." Daehyun focused. On the mantelpiece, an antique pendulum clock swung. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The rhythm was precise, mechanical, and soothing. It was the first orderly thing he had heard in his life. He latched onto it, using the metronome to sync his breathing, slowing the frantic galloping of his heart. As the panic receded, it was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. The chip. The red, pulsing chip that lay on the table like an extracted tumor. He reached out and picked it up, feeling its weight. It was high-grade tech, military application. This wasn't a medical error. It was a prison sentence disguised as a cure. He looked at Imani, his voice rasping, and used the modulation required for speech he could actually hear. "How long?" he asked. The sound of his own voice was deep, gravelly, foreign. Imani didn't flinch. "Since the beginning," she said softly. "The device wasn't broken, Daehyun. It was locked." The implication was a vast, sprawling architecture of cruelty. His silence had been the foundation of his empire, but it had also been his leash, held by men he called brothers. The following morning brought the true test, a performance of deception that required every ounce of Dae-hyun's iron will. He had to play the deaf king, the silent dragon, while the world roared its secrets into his newly awakened ears. He sat at the head of the mahogany conference table in his private boardroom, the leather chair creaking beneath him, a sound he now knew signaled shifting weight, nervousness. Lieutenant Choi sat to his right, and Dr. Kong, the architect of his silence, sat to his left. They went through the motions of the weekly briefing. Choi used sign language, his hands moving with practiced, sharp efficiency. Revenue is up 12% in the Incheon sector. The dock workers are compliant. But as Choi signed, Dae-hyun heard the wet, sticky sound of the man's tongue peeling from the roof of his mouth, and then the murmur under his breath. The Russians are pushing for a bigger cut. If he doesn't agree, they'll burn the warehouse. Dae-hyun kept his face an impassive mask, staring at Choi's hands, pretending to absorb only the visual data. The disconnect was jarring. The sign language said compliance. The voice said mutiny. Then Dr. Kong spoke, not bothering to sign because he believed his patient was in a soundless void. His vitals are stable, but he looks tired, Choi. Maybe the dosage needs increasing. If he becomes lucid. If he starts asking questions, the doctor's voice was reedy, high-pitched, vibrating with a coward's tremor. Choi chuckled, a low, guttural sound that grated on Dae-hyun's ears like grinding stones. He won't ask questions. He's a dog that knows its kennel. As long as he can't hear the wolves coming, he needs us to guide him. The rage that flooded Dae-hyun was not hot. It was absolute zero. It was the freezing point of the soul. He watched their lips move, watched the arrogance dance in their eyes. They discussed skimming profits. They discussed the maintenance of his disability. They discussed him as if he were a piece of malfunctioning machinery. Every scratch of a pen on paper, every clear of a throat, every rustle of a suit jacket was a piece of evidence. He was gathering intelligence not through spies, but through the very air they breathed. He nodded slowly, signing back. Good work. Proceed as planned. The irony tasted like blood in his mouth. That night, the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from clinical to conspiratorial, the air thick with the tension of unsaid things and the budding heat of a shared secret. Dae-hyun stood by the window, listening to the rain lash against the glass, a violent, percussive rhythm that he was beginning to understand. Imani entered, carrying a tray of tea. He didn't need to turn around to know she was there. He heard the soft friction of her footsteps, the clink of porcelain, the intake of her breath. "Who are you?" he asked, not turning from the window. He heard her set the tray down. "I was a nurse at the clinic," she confessed, her voice steady, but laced with a melancholic weight. "I worked in audiology. I saw your file 3 years ago. The scans. They didn't make sense. Your cochlear nerve was intact. Healthy. Robust. But the diagnostics always showed zero activity." She paused, and he heard the rustle of her uniform as she wrung her hands, a nervous tick she usually suppressed. "I asked Dr. Kong about it. The next day, I was fired. Blacklisted. I lost my license, my apartment, everything. I ended up cleaning floors to survive. When the agency sent me here, I knew I had to check the device." Dae-hyun turned then, looking at her. In the dim light, she was a revelation. He stepped closer, the distance between them closing until he could hear the faint, rapid beat of her heart. It was the most honest sound he had heard all day. "You risked your life," he murmured, reaching out to touch the side of her face. His hand was rough, scarred from years of violence. Her skin was soft, warm. "Why?" She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "Because silence should be a choice," she whispered. Not a cage. The romance that bloomed between them in that moment wasn't born of flowers or courtship. It was forged in the fires of survival. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, and for the first time, he listened to the sound of another person's breathing not as a medical sign, but as a shared intimacy. The world was loud, dangerous, and treacherous, but in the circle of her arms, the noise fell away, leaving only the rhythm of two people plotting a war. The trap was set with the meticulous precision of a composer writing a symphony. Dae-hyun arranged a private dinner, a celebration of the quarter's earnings. He invited only the inner circle, Choi, Dr. Kong, and two of the key capos who had been conspiring with the Russians. The dining room was prepared for acoustic perfection, hard surfaces, minimal drapery. He wanted to hear everything. He wanted to hear the fear. As they ate, the mood was jovial, fueled by expensive wine and the assumption of the boss's ignorance. Imani served the courses, moving like a shadow, her eyes meeting Daehyun's briefly, a silent exchange of readiness. Daehyun sat at the head of the table, his implant covered by his hair, the processor turned to maximum sensitivity. He heard the scrape of silverware on china, the gulping of wine, the shifting of feet under the table. He waited until the main course was cleared. Then he tapped his glass with a spoon.
Ting, ting, ting.
The sound was crystal clear, a piercing note that cut through the conversation. The room fell silent. Daehyun looked at Choi. He didn't sign. He didn't gesture. He simply opened his mouth and spoke, his voice booming, resonant, and terrifyingly controlled. "Do you think," he began, savoring the shock that rippled through the room, the collective gasp that sounded like the air being sucked out of an airlock, "that the Russians will pay you enough to cover the cost of your betrayal?" The silence that followed was absolute, but to Daehyun, it was deafening. He heard Dr. Kang's glass slip from his fingers and hit the table, thud. He heard Choi's breath hitch, a strangled wheeze of panic. He heard the safety catches of the guards' guns clicking off at the door, guards who were loyal to the dragon, not the lieutenant. "You can hear," Choi whispered, the color draining from his face, leaving him ashen. "Since when?" Daehyun stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, a deliberate, aggressive sound. "Long enough to hear you sell me out for copper coins," Daehyun said. "Long enough to hear the doctor laugh about my condition." He walked around the table, the sound of his footsteps heavy and rhythmic, like a judge's gavel. The resolution was swift, brutal, and loud. There was no need for a lengthy trial. In the underworld, the sentence for treason was written in lead and blood. But Daehyun did not raise a hand. He merely nodded to the shadows. The doors burst open. The sound of violence that followed was a chaotic mix of shouts, struggles, and the finality of gunshots.
Bang, bang.
The concussive blasts rang in Daehyun's ears, sharp and stinging, but he did not flinch. He watched as Choi and Kong were dragged away, their pleas for mercy falling on ears that were now mercilessly open. When the room was finally empty, save for the bodies of the betrayers and the scent of gunpowder, Daehyun stood alone in the center of the carnage. The ringing in his ear subsided, replaced by the humming silence of a city outside. He walked to the balcony doors and threw them open. The roar of Seoul rushed in, the traffic, the wind, the distant shouts of the living. It was a cacophony, a mess, a disaster of noise. And it was beautiful. Imani stepped out beside him, wiping a speck of blood from her cheek. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. He could hear her presence. He turned to her, the wind whipping his hair, the sensory overload now a manageable hum in the background of his consciousness. He took her hand, squeezing it, feeling the bones and sinew, hearing the friction of skin on skin. He was the dragon, no longer silent, but roaring with the force of a storm unleashed. The city below didn't know it yet, but the rules had changed. The man who listened to everything had arrived, and his reign would be thunderous. He looked at Imani, and for the first time in his life, he whispered a secret that wasn't a lie. "Music," he said, looking at the chaos of the lights below. "It's all music," and as the sirens wailed in the distance, creating a harmony with the wind, he pulled her close, the architect of his freedom, and finally, truly listened.